Welcome to Proclaiming Justice, a podcast from PJTN that focuses the light of truth on vital issues in today's headlines that impact every American. I'm your host, Laurie Cardoza Moore, founder and president of Proclaiming Justice to the Nations, and I'm here to educate, motivate, and activate you to action. I want to arm you with the truth and the facts you'll need to fight and preserve our constitutional republic and uphold the Judeo-Christian values our nation was founded upon. Welcome to Proclaiming Justice, a PJTN podcast where we shine the light of biblical truth on vital issues from today's headlines that impact every American, Jew and Christian, people of faith, and people of conscience. I'm your host, Laurie Cardoza Moore. If you missed the last episode of this podcast, you will find it and our previous podcast lineup on our website at pjtn.org, as well as all the other platforms that you use to access your favorite podcasts. On this week's podcast, I have invited Danny Seaman, an Israeli political commentator and media analyst. As a 31-year veteran of the Israeli government, he retired in 2014 as Deputy Director General of the Ministry of Public Diplomacy and Diaspora Affairs. He served from 2000 to 2010 as Director of the Government Press Office, which is part of the Office of the Prime Minister, responsible for coordination with the foreign press in Israel. He is author of the recently published book, Israel and the Foreign Media, where he has written about how Israel is presented by international media. I also want to remind our audience that as a PJTN watchman, it's your biblical duty to listen and share this and all of our previous podcasts with your family and friends so that they can take action against the issues that threaten our republic and the state of Israel. So please remember to like and share. As it goes with Israel, so it shall go with the United States. Danny, thank you so much for joining us on Proclaiming Justice. It's great to have you on the show.
It's my absolute pleasure. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, it's been a while, and you're addressing an issue, a topic that is very near and dear to my heart. In fact, it's why we started Proclaiming Justice to the Nations back in really 2002, because we saw the disinformation campaign against Israel in the media. And it's not just, here in the United States and in Europe. Even in Israel, we see this. So you've got an amazing background as Israeli political commentator and media analyst. And of course, being a veteran of the Israeli government, you've been dealing with this issue for many, many years. Let's begin with your recently published book, Israel and the Foreign Ministry, where you've written about the bias in foreign media with regards to Israel.
Yeah, it was a while for it to come out. As you mentioned, I had retired about 9 years ago, and I had spent over 30 years with the Israeli government. 10 of those years, I was the director of the Government Press Office, which is responsible for handling the foreign press in Israel. You're saying that you created your organization in 2002. That was at basically the peak of what we call here the Arab violence against Israel, the Intifada, right, as we called it, the suicide bombings that occurred 20 years ago against the citizens of the state of Israel. Right. At that time, a year earlier, I was appointed as the director of the Government Press Office, working with the foreign press. And you would expect that the journalists and the international media, and we had one of the largest foreign press corps in the world. And if you take it per capita or per square kilometer, we obviously had the largest foreign press corps in the world, covering Israel and the conflict here with the Arab nations and with the Arabs in Judea and Samaria. Right. And these journalists around that time, you would expect that they would, when there was an assault, and this was in the midst of the so-called peace process with the Palestinian Authority, with the PLO. Right. And they turned and they took advantage of we trying to reach some kind of accommodations with them. We let the PLO settle in areas in Judea and Samaria, in the Arab towns and villages, hoping that this would encourage them to be go to peace with Israel. Instead, they used this opportunity to set out on a murderous campaign against Israeli citizens, civilians, blowing up buses, blowing up restaurants, supermarkets, murdering over 2,000 in the period of 4 years, over 2,000 Israeli men, women, and children. And in my position, I was there on location. I live in Jerusalem, and the office was in Jerusalem. And sometimes we would hear the explosions, and we would reach the location sometimes before even the security and the rescue forces arrived, and we would see what was going on. And the media are in that area as well, and they arrived on the scene. And it was astounding to me how so many of them were showing, well, it wasn't even sympathy. There was no sympathy, certainly, for the Israelis at that point, but they were making excuses for it. And that was so irritating and so aggravating, especially when you see the bodies of children being carried out. I don't expect them to support Israel at that point. Be professional. But they were looking for excuses and justifying and justifications. And the more we looked into it at around that time, we found out maybe the most important element was that from 93 until 2000, they were in a sense embedded in Palestinian society. And I use the term embedding because this is something that the Americans did in the Gulf War years before, was embedding. This was sort of the what they learned from the Vietnam War. They tried to bring media to be with the American soldiers so they get to know them. And they're not just these obscure, faceless, nameless soldiers, but now they're with them day in, day out. They become Billy Bob and Jane, and they know them personally.
Right.
The Arabs did this very well here in Judea and Samaria. Once the Palestinian Authority was created, they had them embedded in their society and became familiar with them. And you add to that a lot of them were politically and ideologically together with the PLO. It makes them very favorable to their cause. Now, Israel was, in a sense, helping that cause because we were moving towards the creation of an Arab state in Judea and Samaria and recognizing the fact that they lived there. But when they turned against Israel, and by the way, I don't, the Israeli government around that time, I don't relieve them of any responsibility because they themselves were denying what we were facing. And instead of understanding that these Arabs were using this against us, they made excuses for it. They eventually lost the election as a result of the terrorism. But up until the time that Netanyahu and then Ariel Sharon was elected, the government was ignoring and denying all that was going on. So in the midst of this, I'm dealing here with journalists, and you can tell that I have an American background, and I grew up with this. I think a lot of us grow up in the 60s and the 70s. We had this favorable view of journalists. It sounds a bit maybe childish to say, but it's a view that we had of the media as being these fighters for justice and the American way. Lois Lane and Clark Kent, who didn't, and I had this view of them being like that. And suddenly you encounter them on the day-to-day, and I'm not even talking about the Europeans, I'm talking about American media right now. I had this so much respect for them and what I expected them to be. These people are exposing the truth and really fighting for justice. And it was very disappointing, to say the least. These are people who have political ideology and were going to move forward with it. And many of them were supporters of the PLO. And they were sent here in addition to being embedded in that society. It is also a ruthless society, one that is not democratic. And it made it very clear that if they wanted the cooperation of the PLO and of these terrorist organizations, they had to be very favorable in their reporting, and many of them caved into that. And that's unfortunately why we had a very warped presentation of what was happening here.
Absolutely. You remind me of an incident. We had our team over there filming the Boycott This documentary, and it was exposing the whole BS of the BDS movement. And we sent over our camera crew and the gentleman that was, and nobody knows, unless you're in the Christian world, you don't know who the star of the documentary film was, Brad Stein. But he went in to interview the head of the PA, Palestinian Authority. And he started asking, all the usual suspect questions, and the guy was answering just fine. And then he really started to use his journalistic prowess and started challenging this gentleman on the policies of the Palestinian Authority and what was happening to Israel and how things were being reported. And why are people still in the Balata camps in the Palestinian-controlled area? Why are these people still there? Why aren't they set free so that they can? There's plenty of space to build buildings. Why don't you just build a apartment complex and take these people out of squalor and put them into, give them some dignity, put them into a building? And the gentleman that he was interviewing said, if I would have known that this was the direction the questions were going to go, I never would have agreed to this interview.
It's interesting you say that. I mentioned exactly something similar that a German journalist told me about his encounter before the peace treaty with the PLO, before the Oslo Accords. He met with Arafat in Lebanon, and he spoke to Arafat, and he says that when he was asking these questions, they started getting, well, first off, they held him there till in the middle of the night, and finally they gave him access to Arafat. And when he starts asking the questions, Arafat starts yelling at him, do you know who you're speaking to? I'm president or whatever, chairman Arafat. And they told him they told the journalist to leave. He starts leaving, and then they come by and say, oh, look, we apologize. He's a bit angry. Don't ask these. And they give him a list of questions that he's to ask. And when I'm saying to him, well, what did you do? He said, well, I asked those questions. I said, well, why? That's not professional. He said, well, I wanted the interview. I said, you make no mention of this in the article that you wrote. So they were willing to really give up on their professional standards in order to get a story, to get access. So it's not surprising what you're telling me, because this was the system. It just verifies what this journalist said to me.
What's interesting, Danny, is the slippery slope that started way back then, using the whole conflict, the Arab-Israeli conflict, as the launch pad. And now you look, or for me, I don't know, I do follow the media in Europe, not as closely as here in the United States, but you look at what's happening in the United States, even with our current administration, and the disinformation that is being presented through the media, or the lack of coverage of the media from a fair and balanced position, is frightening. And, you can go back, just like what you said, you can go back and, to the time of the first and second Intifada, and you can see where the media back then was doing what we're seeing happen today.
Well, Laurie, when we started writing this, the title I wanted for it was The Cradle of Fake News. We know this area to be the cradle of the three religions. It is very much the cradle of fake news. They didn't like it. The publisher didn't like it. I think because of this was during the time that Trump was president, and he sort of coined that term. And they didn't like the make it associated to him. I personally had no problem with that. But it is, when you look at the behavior and the standards and the lessening of standards here, what started with the coverage, unlike everything, anything that starts with Israel eventually reaches out to the rest of the world. The same thing with the media coverage, with the poor standards, with the lowering of standards, with the lying, with the deceptions, with the making concessions to those who are violent and to non-democratic elements, and catering to them. All this is basically, again, the cradle of fake news. It all started here, and then it's no surprise that it spread to the United States, to Europe, and even with the Israeli media. I also have criticism about them. They're no better in this case. Every one of these Western media organizations that are supposed to be the standard bearers of professional journalism, they've all failed miserably. What we call today the mainstream media, I call them the old media. They failed miserably at doing their jobs, at everything that, they're supposed to be the fourth estate. You have the three estates of a government, you have the judicial, you have the executive. the ones who are supposed to, for us, for the people, are supposed to be there for us. They're supposed to provide us with the information. Let us make our own decisions in a democratic society. They
Correct.
failed us. They not only failed us, they're deceiving us. And they're trying to
Yes.
tell us what to think. And all of this started with the coverage of the Middle East conflict.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a one of the 10 commandments, bearing false witness, that we are not to bear false witness against our brother. And the media, the mainstream media, on a repeated basis does this against Israel, against America. It is just absolutely outrageous. Just as we're witnessing the media disinformation campaign against Israel in the media, in the U.S., it pertains to her rights to her ancient homeland. And see, here's the United States. Unfortunately, our government, our department, our Secretary of State doesn't agree with the majority of Americans. They have their own agenda, but the majority of Americans, and I would say even that, we saw with the Trump supporters. And I would just tell you, I would go back to that name, or at least use that as a subtitle, because that's a great way to sell a bunch of books.
That's what I thought.
People will tie that to Trump, and remember, half of the Americans voted for him. But if you listen to the mainstream media in the United States, you would think that he's the most evil thing. And
you know how popular he is in Israel. He is
yes,
very popular among Israelis.
Absolutely, absolutely. I was there when he moved the embassy to Jerusalem and was so proud to be an American. Now I'm embarrassed. I'm embarrassed for the rest of the free world, the rest of the West, that we are such a poor example, and how we've been taken over by this lamestream media that is supposed to do its job, but unfortunately they push disinformation. And that disinformation, especially as it pertains to this conversation about Israel and her rights to her ancient homeland, we are watching the execution of this campaign also at the United Nations. We see the International Press Corps. And like you said, even in Israel, we have a duty, ladies and gentlemen. We have to speak up. We cannot lose our ability to communicate truth. We get shut down on YouTube. Danny, I can't tell you how many times I've had videos removed. I've been shut out of Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. I've been in Twitter jail because I'd put up little blurbs or put up links to our films and our shows about Israel's rights to her ancient homeland, and it doesn't fit the social media platforms' agenda or their messaging or their fair use. No, it's absolutely out of control and unacceptable. But this disinformation campaign has led to misinformation. And I want to share with you, a couple years ago, back in 2019, we hosted 3 events in South Africa, one in Pretoria, one in Johannesburg, one in Cape Town. And each city, I went and spoke with the pastoral leaders, and I think there were some political leaders that were present as well. And I said to the pastors, the whole boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, the apartheid the accusation of Israel being an apartheid state came out of South Africa. And I said to the pastors, how could you have sat back and allowed this disinformation, allowed these people in Durban to bear false witness against our brother Judah, against the Jews living in Israel, against the Israeli government? How could you allow this to happen? By your silence, you told the church and the rest of the Western world that Israel must be guilty because you didn't speak up. You have to speak up. And unfortunately, even in South Africa, even in Australia, who used to be, allies to Israel, now we even see this hatred of Israel, these false accusations, this disinformation that is creating the misinformation against this whole conflict in the Middle East.
That's you mentioned that, and it's so true, especially with the South African issue. The people on the left in the world are one of the things they keep speaking about is cultural appropriation. What is more appropriation than taking the whole issue of apartheid, and which was a horrible thing? And anybody who comes here to Israel and sees things on the ground for themselves,
right.
they would think, if that was apartheid, what are they complaining about? That's not that bad. And that's the precise thing. They take advantage of these things, and the Arabs take off of something that was so clear and so horrible, and they appropriate it for their own needs, and nobody in among the African blacks are saying anything about that, which is a shame. I just want to mention something you said before. Please, under no circumstances should any of us, and I say this as a former American myself, never be ashamed of the United States, because what the United States stands for is such a brilliant and such a beautiful and such a wonderful concept. And it's not us, and it's not the people who are damaging it. They're particular people who are doing it. We should be ashamed of them because they're not living up to the American and the American ideals as we were taught. I grew up as a child in the United States. To this day, I still have this, I cherish everything that we were taught in the principles of the United States and what the United States stands for. And we should never be ashamed of that. What people are doing is not our fault. We should continue fighting for it. They're the ones should be ashamed for violating and damaging what the United States stands for. The rest of us, we're still carrying that message. And by the way, I allow myself to say that even as an Israeli, because the values of the United States, the essence of it comes from our Judeo-Christian heritage and our background. All of these values that the United States holds so valuable to them and cherish it so much are the Jewish values that Christianity then spread around the world, and Christians brought it to the new, as they called it, the new promised land, and done a wonderful job of spreading that message around the world. And I believe that, you can try to squelch the truth, but you cannot stop it. And even if you have these people, even if they're running a country, they won't be able to stop the goodness which is in these values.
Amen and amen. You are spot on. And yes, it's the administration that is taking us down this path. And we, the people, are fighting to take back control of our communities because it is unacceptable. And I'm so glad you brought up the Judeo-Christian foundation of the nation. It is the values that came out of the Torah that were brought to the United States. We can look back at the founding of our nation. We look at the founding documents. Look at the role that the Torah played in the drafting of our founding documents, in our form and our structure. The republic, the concept of the republic, actually comes out of the Torah of Moses. And I remember I was quoted, I think, in Tablet magazine last year, condemned because I had the audacity to say that the nation of the United States of America was founded on the Torah of Moses. They were outraged. Of course, I got attacked for it. But, you bring up some very important points. And one of the most recent things that we have seen with regards to the disinformation and misinformation about Israel, accusing her of being an apartheid state, Hamas. We just recently saw another round of missiles launched against civilian population in Israel. The world accuses Israel of war crimes, but refuses to condemn Hamas from launching a barrage of missile attacks on those civilian populations in Israel.
Sorry for interrupting, but it's not only the missiles. Just last week, we had them targeting civilians who were going back to what happened 20 years ago. The same thing is happening now, and it's Hamas in Judea and Samaria. They're not only limited to Gaza, and they went out and they murdered Israelis sitting in a restaurant. They weren't fighting soldiers. There were children there as well. And unfortunately, the American administration requires all sides to be, while we're targeting the armed personnel, we're taking them out with very precision weapons. We're focusing as much as we can because they take refuge among civilians. They try to bring civilian casualties among their own people. They hide behind children, these cowards. And yet the American administration found it necessary to call on all sides to reduce the violence. There is no violence today. There's no Israeli shooting at Gaza right now. And to me, that's very important to say because my family, and I grew up in Ashkelon, my family, which is only 10 miles north of the Gaza Strip. So anytime that there's missiles being fired there, I have an 88-year-old mother. My mother, when she was younger, she had polio. So it's very hard for her to walk. I never noticed it because despite her problems, she never let us feel it as children, but now she's added to that is the age. She's 88 years old. It's very hard for her. She has 30 seconds to run from the bedroom into a secure room. She said she can't make it. There's more. She has more of a chance of falling and injuring herself, so she stays in bed. I give a lot of credit to my mom. She's been through a lot in life, and so she's not afraid of it. But there are a lot of all the kids there suffer from post trauma, and yet. Right now, we're not firing in the direction of Gaza. Why? Because we only fire in self-defense. If they're not firing it up, if they're not initiating it, there's nothing happens from the Israeli side. But you're not getting that message from the media. They're trying to make this seem as it's a bilateral conflict going on. No, it's not. If they don't fire in our direction, and we left Gaza about over 15 years ago, we left every single inch of Gaza. There's not a single Israeli alive or dead because we even took out the bodies from the cemeteries. And still, they're using it, as you're saying, as a launching pad. So you can just imagine what will happen if we move out of Judea and Samaria, which overlooks all of Israel. If we leave there, how they'll use it to make life miserable for all of Israel right now, not only the south of Israel.
Absolutely. And I just want to let our audience know that when we were in Israel filming for our Boycott This documentary, we stood on a hill overlooking, I think it was area A and B. Correct me if I'm wrong, and as we stood there on the side of this mountain, looking down over this area that was controlled by the Palestinian Authority, there was this area to the left in a distance where there was green grass and there was open space. And I said to the guide that had taken us up there, I said, whose territory is that over there? And he said, the Palestinian Authority. And I said to him, then why is Balata still in operation? Why don't they take this land that they have access to, build an high-rise apartment complex, give these people dignity that have been sitting for 3 decades in squalor. But they keep these people here because it continues to further their narrative. Look at what Israel's occupation is doing. Israel is not occupying Palestinian land. As Menachem Begin said, this is not occupied territory. This is liberated territory. And as Christians and Jews, we know what that means because that's biblically, that ties Israel, it ties the Jewish people, it ties the nation of Israel to its ancient biblical homeland.
So, Laurie, if I can add on that particular issue, my family on my mother's side, my father's American. On my mother's side, they're Afghani, Jews from Afghanistan. Wow. And over 100 years ago, after the British took over here after World War I, my family in Afghanistan heard that there were rumors that the Geulah, the redemption, is happening, and Jews are returning as was prophesied. My grandfather and great-grandfather came here in 1918 to see with their own eyes if this was indeed happening. They saw that, yes, the Jews were returning. They went back to Afghanistan. This whole thing took a year in each direction. Gathered the family in 1921, over 100 years ago, they returned. And they returned to them. The land of Israel was clearly the heartland. Judea, Samaria, Shiloh, Hebron, Bethlehem, Shechem, all these areas that they grew up on and the prophecies that they believed would happen. And it's so frustrating at times for me as an Israeli, and I'm not necessarily religious, but I can't argue with it. There was prophecies. Who am I and who are we to belittle that? These were prophesied over 2,000 years ago, and we're living that. What people dreamt of and they couldn't believe would actually happen, we're living it. The prophecies are happening. A few years ago, when my youngest son was born, he's now 10 years old. But when he was born, the municipality in Jerusalem, they send you after a month that they planted the tree in the name of your child. And in that certificate that they send you, they quote from Zechariah. And in the book of Zechariah, they said there that it will come in the days that at the end of the time, the old people will be sitting in the streets of Jerusalem. The children will be playing amongst them. And I got this just that week It was the week of the tabernacles. And here in Jerusalem, there are celebrations in the streets. You have these fairs in the different streets of Jerusalem. And that is exactly what happened. The old people were sitting around and the children were playing. And I got chills reading this and seeing this and saying, listen,
Yes.
we're living this. We're living this right now. And that's the privilege. And that's why I'm saying for 2,000 years, Jews wanted to return to these locations.
Yes.
And many of the Arabs, with all due respect to them, why are they keeping these people in the refugee camps? Because there is no such thing as a Palestinian people. There are different tribes, and you know where they came from by their last names. When you have a name called El Masri, that means they came from Egypt. If they have a name, different names that come from different places in the Arab world, because what are they? They're Arabs. They came from Arabia. Jews came from Judea, the heartland of the state of Israel. So they don't care about the people in the refugee camps because they're not from their tribe. They're not from their family background. That's why it's so easy for them. And on the other hand, we in the state of Israel absorb Jews from all over the world. Over 3 million Jews from all over the world, and especially from the Arab world, were absorbed here because they were Jews and they were one family. And that's why we accepted them all in the state of Israel. And you have no Jewish refugee camps because we took them and made them part of the state of Israel. What the Arabs didn't do because they didn't care about them. To them, there is no such thing as the Palestinian people.
That's so good. You nailed it on the head, Danny. That is amazing. Thank you so much for sharing this with our audience. We've covered a lot of information today, ladies and gentlemen, and I just want to remind you, if you want to learn more about Israel's rights to her ancient, historical, legal, biblical rights to her ancient homeland, there is a documentary film. I want to encourage you to go to our website at pjtn.org. It's called Israel Indivisible, The Case for the Ancient Homeland. And of course, our Boycott This documentary is there. All of our documentary films, our Focus on Israel shows are there. You can watch our Focus on Israel shows actually on the website for free. So take the time, educate and inform yourself, and then share that information. Danny, in closing, are there any final comments you would like to share with our audience, and how can they order a copy of your book to learn more about what you're doing?
Well, it's hard to order the copy of the book because it was actually published by Cambridge scholars for academia, for libraries, and for courses on the topic itself. So right now it's not available to the general public by only order by universities. I also recently have been working with an Israeli NGO called the IDSF, and I believe you interviewed last week the founder of the organization, the Israel Defense and Security Forum. And this is a group of former military personnel and leaders of Israel who are giving the message of a strong Israel, not only to the Israeli public, but also our ties around the world. It's a conservative movement of former commanders. You can find that at www.IDSF, Israel Defense Security Forum.org.il. And probably eventually the book will be offered there, but right now it's not available for the general public.
Well, thank you so much for letting us know. And yes, for our audience, we did interview General Avivi last week. So you can also listen to that podcast again on your favorite podcast platform. So, ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you for joining us. Danny, it's been such a blessing and an honor to be with you. We could go on forever, but I'm going to see you in Jerusalem, God willing, this fall. And so thank you so much. And ladies and gentlemen, I hope you found this program informative. We're going to post this podcast on our website and all of our podcast platforms so that you can share with your family and friends. Remember, as PJTN Watchmen, we have a biblical mandate to stand against the ungodly, rising Nazi threat that is destroying this nation and other Western nations, threatening our Judeo-Christian values and promoting anti-Semitism. We cannot remain silent. God warned the prophet Ezekiel about the responsibility of the watchman, and it is the duty. If the watchman is standing his watch and he sees an enemy advancing, it is his duty to warn the inhabitants of the community so that they can prepare themselves. But if the watchman doesn't warn the people, then, and if any innocent blood is shed, God's going to require it of that watchman, that shed blood. But if the watchman warns the people, and the people refuse to heed the warning of the watchman, if any innocent blood is shed, it's required of them. So it's our duty, ladies and gentlemen. It is our responsibility. We cannot let our brother Judah have to contend with this battle of fighting to get her information out to the people. We cannot tolerate the disinformation and misinformation. This is bearing false witness against our brethren, and it cannot be tolerated. So, Lord, ladies and gentlemen, please share, like this podcast to help sound the alarm in your community. And remember, Dietrich Bonhoeffer reminded us that silence in the face of evil is itself evil. God will not hold us guiltless. Not to speak is to speak. Not to act is to act. So don't forget to join us for next week's podcast as we continue this conversation about combating the rise of anti-Semitism and taking back local control of our communities and our children's education. I want to also remind you that if you have not signed up to become a PJTM Watchman, you can help support this mission through our award-winning documentaries and Focus on Israel programs, as well as more programs like this for just $20 a month. So go to our website at pjtn.org to watch our programs and listen to our past podcasts. With your generous monthly donation, you can ensure that PJTN remains on the front lines and in the headlines, but we can't do it without your faithful prayers and financial support. I hope that you will prayerfully consider supporting our mission as we educate to activate Jews, Christians, and all people of conscience to stand on the front lines of this all-encompassing war. God bless you, and thank you for all you do on behalf of our Jewish brethren, the State of Israel, and these United States.
Thank you again for joining me on this edition of Proclaiming Justice. Please share this podcast with your family and friends. For more information about how you can get involved, please visit our website at pjtn.org. As a PJTN Watchman, you can help us keep up the fight to preserve our freedom for our children and their children for such a time as this.